and welcome to the virtual Common Hour. My name is Rachel Anderson Rayburn, and I'm the co-chair this year, along with Jim Strick of the Common Hour Committee and an associate professor of theater. I would like to introduce our most excellent ASL interpreter for today, Emily Phipps. Please note that you will need to select split screen if you want to be able to see the ASL interpretation while a PowerPoint or video is up. We are very happy that all of you are here with us. The Common Hour is a 10-year-old academic program that brings the entire Franklin and Marshall community together for weekly cultural and academically enriching events, and historically pizza during the academic year. It is the only regularly scheduled event that brings all of the F&M as well as the local community together. We continue our tradition of gathering weekly as a community to share this common experience and to continue the conversations, even exclusively with virtual pizza. Next week's Common Hour features Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha, the 2020 Mueller Fellow, in an interview with Professor Chris Williams about the Flint, Michigan water crisis, entitled What the Eyes Don't See. This semester, we are featuring virtual pizza servers. This week's group is F&M Votes. F&M Votes is a nonpartisan coalition of faculty, staff, and students that seeks to educate students about voting, register students to vote, and encourage everyone who is able to vote to vote. The deadline to register to vote in Pennsylvania is coming on Monday, October 19th. You can easily register to vote on campus. Please look at the email you received from F&M Votes this past weekend for complete info. There are pop-up voter registration sessions at the Harwood Commons patio today from 2:30 to 4, tomorrow from 1:30 to 3:30, and Friday from 10 to noon. These next few days are your opportunity to make a difference in what might be the most important voting state in the country. Please also see the chat for info about 2 discussions about the election today at Brooks and Weiss Houses following this Common Hour. We will have Q&A at the end of the hour. Students, staff, and faculty can submit questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window. We won't identify people by name, but please tell us in the Q&A if you are a student and what year you are, or for faculty and staff, what department or office you are in. And now I would like to introduce the proposer of this event, Stephen Medvick, the Honorable and Mrs. John C. Kunkel Professor of Government and a founding as well as current member of the Common Hour Committee.
Thank you very much, Rachel. On behalf of the Government Department, it's my pleasure to introduce this year's Jerome Weinstein Memorial Lecturer, Professor Julia R. Azari. Over the years, the Weinstein Lecture has been given by eminent scholars, prominent journalists, and leading politicians. And we are grateful to the Weinstein family, and in particular, Paul Weinstein, class of 1953, for their generosity. Professor Azari is Associate Professor of Political Science at Marquette University, where she also serves as Director of Graduate Studies. Her areas of research expertise include the American presidency, political communication and rhetoric, and political parties. She's the author of a wonderful book entitled Delivering the People's Message, The Changing Politics of the Presidential Mandate, which was published in 2014 by Cornell University Press. In 2019, she was a distinguished visiting scholar at the John W. Kluge Foundation at the Library of Congress, where she was working on a book manuscript about weak parties and strong partisanship in the United States. This observation of hers, that our political parties are organizationally weak while partisan identity in the United States is strong, is a critically important insight into how American politics operates today. She tells me that the book is in the early stages of being written, but I would urge those who are concerned about American electoral democracy to keep an eye out for it and to read it as soon as it's available. Professor Azari was the inaugural winner of the Best Public-Facing Scholar Award presented by the Information Technology and Politics section of the American Political Science Association. She writes regularly for the political science blog Mischiefs of Faction, the data journalism site 538.com, and is a co-host of the podcast Politics in Question. She's also, in my opinion, a must-follow on Twitter. We're extremely fortunate to have her here today, so please join me in welcoming Professor Julia Azari.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm delighted to be here today, and I wish that I were there in Pennsylvania with all of you eating some pizza. but instead I'm coming to you from my office here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where on Monday I talked about the importance of the Pennsylvania race with my students. So from one swing state to another, I greet you. I'm going to talk about elections, presidential elections in a time of crisis, and try to look at the context of crisis politics, and also the depth and strength of ordinary political forces that have actually kept our politics from being too disrupted by the extraordinary circumstances that we now face. Josh, I think you're running the PowerPoint for me, so this is just the introductory slide. If you want to advance, I'll start by telling us what we all already know, which is that nothing seems normal in 2020 between the coronavirus pandemic, the circumstances of economic collapse and unemployment, and what I've somewhat euphemistically here referred to as political intensity. This is, I think, characterized by the depth and intensity of partisan polarization, the questions that we have about the potential for a peaceful transfer of power, and the questions that we have over the very foundations of how we do politics, how we administer elections, how Republicans and Democrats across the different branches of government relate to each other in Washington, D.C. The Supreme Court hearings are going on as we speak. And so all of this is made for a very deeply politically intense year. If you want to advance the slide, Josh, then the next thing I want to draw our attention to as we address this question of everything feeling like it's not normal is that this is a kind of common tagline of the Trump era used by the opponents of the president. That some of the things that have struck his critics as outside of the boundaries of normal politics include comments about opponents and parts of the country, including comments, places like Puerto Rico, Baltimore. More recent set of concerns about the peaceful transfer of power and the president's sort of skirting of that question. Earlier in the administration, there was a lot of talk about the absence of full executive branch staffing, particularly the State Department has become kind of empty. And then finally, concerns about white supremacist groups and the different instances in which the president has not disavowed these groups. So these are all things that we don't expect in our politics and that have struck people as not normal. And all of this might add up to us thinking, well, everything about politics should just be kind of rocked on its foundation. But I'm here to talk about whether that's true and why it's not. Why it seems like our politics is actually very robust to disruption, even in these unusual conditions. Next slide, please. So I've been thinking a lot about this idea of disruption. This is one of the ideas that Donald Trump used in his 2016 bid, first for the nomination and then for the presidency. It's also a theme that we sometimes hear in some parts of the left. But much of what we've observed during the course of the Trump presidency, including this last very unusual and difficult year, has roots in long-term political forces. I think knowing the difference between what's normal and what's extraordinary helps us deepen our understanding of our politics. And it also helps us make an important distinction, which is that something might be normal or ordinary in our politics or have long-standing roots, still not be okay. Next slide, please. All right, so I'm going to look at this through the lens of three questions and just give like a little taste of data and political science on each of these. The first is, how has partisan polarization shaped our COVID response? And is that unusual? The second is, how much influence do presidents exert over their own parties? So the concrete question here is the Republican Party Trump's party? And we might also contemplate, what are the possibilities for the Democratic Party being Joe Biden's party or something else? And then finally, I think the question that's on everyone's mind, what can we expect on election day and after? I don't really have all the answers there, but I do have a few features of the political system that I'd like to draw your attention to. So if you could advance the slide, Josh. Next up, so I want to just kind of give a basic overview here that there's a group of 3 researchers, Gadarian, Goodman, and Popinski, that are doing um, they're doing some research, some survey research on partisanship and COVID. And it turns out partisanship, not age or other factors, is really important in predicting how people respond in terms of what they're worried about, what their policy preferences are for what should be done about the virus. And this kind of violates our sense and our assumption in the conventional wisdom that crisis unites the country. And that we're all, as the signage said earlier in the year, we're all in this together, and that you might expect that this pandemic crisis would unite Republicans and Democrats against, a common, and that there would be more common perceptions, since there's not a lot of reason to believe that Republicans and Democrats are having dramatically different experiences. And in fact, the Pew Research Foundation, a study there, reports that it doesn't seem like they are having dramatically different experiences with the economy or with the disease. So we're experiencing the same reality. We're looking at the same world, yet Republicans and Democrats are having different responses. So in the next slide, I'll show you a little bit more recent data about this. This is from the Morning Consult poll that was taken just a few days after President Trump's positive COVID test on October. It was, I guess, announced on October 1st. So these really struck me. There's 2 separate questions. Voters were asked whether President Trump was right or wrong to say that Americans should not be afraid of COVID-19. He tweeted that out a couple of days after his diagnosis. But then, so that's kind of an opinion question. That's an evaluation. They were also asked how would they rate the current state of President Donald Trump's health. This is a factual question. I guess not one we're likely to really know in great depth, but it's a factual question. What was interesting to me is that while the partisan differences, depending on how you slice them, are not that different, Republicans, so only 56% of Republicans said that Trump was right to say that Americans shouldn't be afraid of COVID-19, but 80% rated his health as excellent, very good, or very fair, compared with about 25% of Democrats. So it kind of seemed like, Republicans are actually more likely to go along with the president on a matter of empirics than they were on a matter of opinion. And so that got me thinking about whether this is unique, that what's now dividing Republicans and Democrats isn't so much their policy opinions or their ideology, but their actual perception of the world. Is that a feature of the Trump era? So in the next slide, I will give you some evidence that the answer to that is actually no. And here, I apologize for the graininess of this. This is a screenshot of a PDF. This is from a book called Why Washington Won't Work by Mark Hetherington and Tom Rudolph, and it came out in 2015. So it predates the Trump era, went to press before any of this happened. And what it does, what you see here from the American National Election Study, is a set of questions posed to respondents about whether they rated the performance of the economy as worse, the same, or better. It's kind of like having an eye test. In the context of 2002, the economy had gone into kind of a slump. And you see that reflected in both the Republican and Democratic responses there. So you have the dark bar on the left is worse, right? And you see far more Republicans rating worse, or excuse me, far more Democrats rating it worse than Democrats, and more Republicans saying it's the same. And this is in 2002, during a period where George W. Bush has pretty recently been elected president, and Republicans are in a narrow control of the House and kind of 50-50 Senate. So it's a Republican era. 2004, still a Republican era. We get kind of a modest recovery at this point. And you see it with Republicans, the same and better sort of looks the same, right? Or reflects that reality that it's kind of a soft recovery. So some Republicans think better, some think the same, not that many think worse. Among Democrats, worse is by far the winner. And so what we see here is that prior to anything going on in the Trump era, Republicans and Democrats do evaluate the same set of circumstances through different lenses and have different views. And this also holds, these authors find, for foreign policy performance, that when your party controls the White House, you're more likely to have a positive evaluation, even though you're looking at basically the same set of facts. We saw this in even more dramatic fact after 2016, after the election, when Republicans and Democrats kind of immediately reversed in their evaluation of the economy, even though not much changed in the economy between, say, October of 2016 and December. So my point here is that while it might seem particularly unusual in the context of the coronavirus for Republicans and Democrats to perceive the same situation in different ways, or to have really different versions of reality, this isn't a totally new phenomenon, and it isn't a phenomenon of 2020 or specific to the Trump era. It may be magnified in the current moment, but it didn't start here. In the next slide, I want to go deeper into this, drawing from the same kind of era of research on the George W. Bush years. I think this is really one of the most fascinating graphs that I have seen, because it gets at the question of, when did we become so deeply polarized? And I think it kind of calls into question the conventional wisdom and assumption that crises bring people together. So in 2001, we have the September 11th terrorist attacks in New York and in DC, and the country does kind of briefly come together. But I think what we see when we look at the beginning of the George W. Bush presidency, the 2000 election, and then subsequent years, what we see is that actually that period of time produced some of these deep divisions. So this is just a little bit of data to suggest that. And we see, so on the right, we have the 2000 election, and that's essentially what we like to call a normal distribution. So we have a concentration of people kind of in the middle. And then, as you might imagine, the people on the ends, the people on the extremes, the people who really dislike Bush or really love him are fewer in number, right? Are less common. And so most people are kind of in the middle. And that's a common assumption about how public opinion works. But by 2004, this is quite different. By 2004, we actually see that people are starting to move to the extremes, and more people either really like Bush or really dislike him, and that middle starts to hollow out. So I think obviously every big crisis is different, and the September 11th attacks were their own thing, and the coronavirus crisis is its own thing. Their own tragic implications, the policy choices that they have presented, and the ideas that they have brought into the country's public discourse. But I think what we can learn here is that we should be a little critical in our response to the idea that crises bring people together, or that they do for very long. It would be great if that were true, but it seems like at least it's not always true. It wasn't true in this instance, and so it's not as surprising that it hasn't been true in the age of COVID. If I could get the next slide, it'd be great. So this sort of gives us to summarize, right? That crisis really does have this limited ability to unify. That this kind of polarization is not new. It's not unique to the Trump era. But again, that doesn't mean it's not serious. It just means that these problems need to be addressed on their own terms. Let me get the next slide. Here, I want to kind of shift a little bit, building on this partisanship theme, but then really thinking about institutions and thinking about our politics, our political actors. How much power do presidents have over their parties? And this is a really, I think, common question among people who follow politics. Is it Trump's party? And as I said, there's some implications there as well for the Biden potential presidency, for Biden's candidacy. But is it Biden's party? What might that mean? So parties over time have become increasingly focused on the presidency, devoted more resources to the presidency, and the way that voters make decisions in elections have become increasingly about the presidency, with a higher correlation between the presidential vote and the vote for senator or for governor. So it's less the case than it once was that different members of the political system kind of have their own political profile, their own constituencies, and that those aren't completely overlapping. They're much more overlapping now than they were 50 years ago. But the level of actual presidential control has always been limited. Members of Congress still have their own incentives. And so to the degree that presidents fill this role of being symbolic party leaders that can persuade partisans about what to think, can lead partisans in their policy positions, then presidents have some sway in their own parties. But to the extent that that symbolic leadership is limited or is superficial, then presidents are still limited in how much they control their own parties. So the next slide, I delve a little bit more into what this means for Trump. So one thing I didn't even mention when I mentioned that 2020 had been an unusual year is that earlier this year, the president was impeached. I frequently refer to this as last year, as last decade. It seems like it's been a while, but it was this year. And one open question that I think we still have to answer is, what were the implications of that for Trump? How did that set him up for the rest of the questions that have unfolded over the course of this year, including re-election and everything that's happened in between? And here I make the argument that impeachment actually slightly weakened the president's political capital. His actual public approval hasn't really changed very much, has been very stable over the course of his presidency. That was also true for Obama. Both of them had public opinion that was not very responsive to events. But when I think about the finer grain of how presidents can influence members of Congress, that they can have varying levels of political capital. And that is the sense that people might take a position because it's the president's position, and that has the potential to make that position popular, either with the base or with the electorate more broadly. And I think impeachment really weakened this sort of sense that Trump might have something extra that the rest of the party doesn't have. I think he went into his presidency with some of that sense, because even though it was a very close and contested election in 2016, it was unexpected. And so I think there was a narrative early on that Trump's brand was a winning brand that Republicans hadn't seen in several presidential cycles. I think that's eroded over time, as it often does, but impeachment really didn't help. There's a lot of public opinion data that is consistent with this. Trump, the idea that impeachment would result in Trump leaving office is slightly more popular consistently than the alternative, although it never really crossed 50% in the 538 average of those polls. But in general, impeachment was relatively popular, and that's unusual. I mean, impeachment itself is unusual, but that's in contrast certainly with the Clinton impeachment 20 years ago. Here I've got some data from earlier this year, from kind of the very end of the impeachment era. So in February 2020, this was published in March of 2020. The Republicans say they agree with Trump on the issues, but only a third like his personal conduct. They dislike his personal conduct. So this is one other way of thinking about Trump versus the rest of the Republican Party and who's really in control. Is that Trump's base of strength is being a kind of standard issue Republican with standard Republican positions. His base of strength does not come from him having kind of high marks as an individual that go above and beyond that party. And ultimately, as we know, the impeachment ended with Trump's acquittal in the Senate, and that every Republican except for Mitt Romney voted for that acquittal. First of all, this is quite normal. What's actually unusual is Romney being the first sitting senator to cast a vote to remove a member of his own party. But it also means that Trump was kind of beholden to Senate Republicans. You often hear the story the other way around, this just shows Senate Republicans are so beholden to Trump. And that's probably true to some degree because he's quite popular with their constituents. But it's also true that that's sort of the norm, that you would vote with your party in that situation. And that kind of, again, made Trump, now he owes his presidency to them. This becomes unusual once again when we move into the pandemic and an unexpected, unanticipated economic crisis, because this really limits Trump's ability to negotiate for a position that's separate and distinct from the usual Republican position on a kind of massive government stimulus, bailout for different industries, coronavirus relief. Trump actually early on in his bid for the presidency had embraced some kind of more liberal positions on some of these kinds of issues, kind of bigger government. There's evidence for this in his statements. There's evidence for this in his support among Republican primary voters. This was a group that was more in favor of entitlements and government spending than Republicans who voted for other candidates in that primary. But again, that's not a standard Republican position. It's not very popular with Republicans in Congress. So one of the things that I'm arguing here is that impeachment had a sort of indirect negative effect on Trump's re-election chances, because he really wasn't in a position to negotiate with congressional Republicans and try to pull them away from their default position on these issues. And as we see right now, Congress has stalled out yet again on a stimulus bill. The president has kind of taken different positions and I think is probably open to a larger stimulus bill, but he just doesn't have the political capital to pull the conservative Republicans in his party toward that position. All right, on the next slide, we can think about what it means for Joe Biden. And this is really just a completely kind of open question. But I want to raise a couple of ideas. I mean, one is that this is totally irrelevant and Biden won't win. If Biden does win, I think there will be a lot of questions about what it means for him to be the leader of his party. Democrats are typically a less ideological party than the Republicans. There's some controversy around this question, but there's a lot of research that is that demonstrates this. They're typically more of a kind of coalition of different groups within the electorate. I think now one of those groups is a kind of left Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders constituency. You've got African Americans, you've got Latinos, you've got the women's movement, you've got younger voters, you've got environmentalists. And I think it's also important that we think about those groups as constituencies versus social movements. So as constituencies, we saw one set of things playing out in the primary, where we had African Americans, largely older and kind of party regular African Americans, really flock to Biden's candidacy. And for these constituencies that consider themselves to be more of like the policy left, which is some younger voters, particularly younger Latinos, younger white voters in the Democratic primary, moving toward Bernie Sanders. So that's a constituency argument. Looking at social movements, we might get something a little different, which is people who go beyond just voting in the Democratic Party, but really are regular activists. And one thing that I think is really striking from the Black Lives Matter movement over the summer is the degree to which that is a social movement with a kind of comprehensive set of positions. So it's not just about criminal justice reform, about policing, or about race, but it also has a comprehensive and pretty left economic agenda. So it'll be interesting to see how constituencies within the Democratic Party versus the people that are more active and working on mobilization might shape the politics of a Biden administration. And then the last question kind of goes back to something that I mentioned before about Trump in 2016 and my own work on election narratives and mandates. If Biden wins, the margin of victory and the narrative around that victory might really matter in terms of how much he's able to drive the agenda of his party and the direction of his party as president. Will, for example, the congressional delegation view him as the driver of the 2020 outcome? I don't know. I think it's unlikely that he'll get, if he wins, people won't find that surprising. It might be a large margin. These narratives, one of the things I find in my book is these narratives often take place and are shaped once the new president takes office. So the election at that point is several months away, is several months in the past, and the narratives can sometimes be only tenuously connected to what actually happened in the election. So it'll be interesting to see if it becomes a kind of, Biden is the bearer of a standard of a kind of middle of the road Obama party, a party of reform, a party of kind of union between more centrist and more leftist forces. It's that could kind of be anybody's guess, and that really might matter in terms of how members of Congress perceive what Biden's victory means for them, and whether they might take a position that they otherwise wouldn't in that context. So those are some of the questions I'm thinking about with Biden. So if we can go into the next slide. This is just sort of my overview of kind of what's new and what isn't. Trump is really the focal point of the party system in a way that I think intensifies what's been a long historical process of presidentialization. Members of Congress have their own political incentives. Even in a highly partisan environment, the president doesn't own them. And so the president is really limited in his ability to get parties to do anything that they don't want to do. Increasingly, I think partisanship means those interests are aligned, but when they're not aligned, it's, the president doesn't hold a lot of bargaining chips necessarily. All right, next up, I'll talk a little bit about what we can expect on election day. So there were a ton of things I wanted to talk about, but there's really just two things that I want to draw attention to here. I think I'll have time to talk about. One is decentralized election administration. And this really is a long-standing feature of the American political system, that states and localities make their own rules about balloting, about who's eligible to vote, about how the ballots are counted, when. These are all, who can vote absentee, which has become a huge issue. These are all decentralized. And the other thing is I want to kind of talk about what I call congressional sorting and what I see in the races in 2020 and some of the lessons from 2018. So if we get the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about local election control. So I tried to summarize this photo, if it makes you nervous, is from 2008. I think the big thing here is that we have always had these localized election administration regimes. It's just now it's likely to be stressed out. The questions of who gets an absentee ballot and how those ballots are processed is going to be completely different than in normal situations. And people who would not normally request to vote by mail or vote absentee or try to vote early are going to probably do so because of the pandemic. This is going to be different by party, we think. And also, I think one source of confusion is that there are different rules in different states about what a ballot needs to be valid. We were talking in my class earlier this week about what you all have, the naked ballot in Pennsylvania and the concern over the envelopes. We don't have anything like that in Wisconsin. And in Wisconsin, it's quite easy to vote absentee. You don't have to have an excuse. In other states, that's different. Some states have changed their rules, others haven't. And it means if you're on social media or you have friends or family across state lines, I think that actually makes for a lot of confusion. This decentralized system, I think, has some advantages if you're worried about fraud or you're worried about a kind of concerted effort to steal the election. It certainly makes that harder, but it also lends itself to confusion. And I think more importantly, court challenges. Where there's likely, I think, to be some litigation over the counting of ballots, particularly if the election is close. Here in Wisconsin, there's been a series of court challenges about whether we can extend the deadline for absentee ballots. And I know that there in Pennsylvania, it's sort of been the opposite situation, and there's been some questions about counting ballots early. So these are the kinds of things that come up, and as I said, they're going to be quite different in different places, and there'll be questions about, I think, who has jurisdiction over different rules. That ultimately was part of the court decision in 2000 that decided that election. All right. Next up, so that's just a little drive-by through localized election control. Next up, I just wanted to briefly touch on congressional races. So there, the picture is Xochitl Torres Small, who is a pretty vulnerable Democratic incumbent, represents a rural and conservative district in New Mexico. And I think one of the things that we saw in 2018 was a kind of sorting of matching places to representatives, either reps in the House or senators. And even though 2018 was quite a good year for Democrats, several Democratic incumbents lost their seats in red states. So we have Heidi Heitkamp in North Dakota. We have the Senate. We had Joe Donnelly in Indiana, and Claire McCaskill in Missouri. And so that, I think that this sort of suggests that we're starting to see more alignment between the parties and the kinds of constituencies that they represent. In 2020, I think this manifests itself in a couple of competitive House races that are where you either have a Democrat like Torres Small, who's representing a rural and conservative area. You have some suburban and increasingly diverse districts in places like Georgia and Texas that have been controlled by Democrats and that look like potential have been controlled by Republicans and look like potential Democratic pickups. And so what I think we see there is a trend in Congress toward Republicans kind of matching their constituencies, matching the more red and rural constituencies, both in the Senate and in House districts, Democrats becoming representatives of blue areas, of diverse areas, of urban and increasingly suburban areas. And that this has the potential to sometimes cut against the kind of national wave. And so there's a sort of interesting tension there between the nationalization of politics, meaning that Democrats sort of represent one type of place and Republicans represent another type of place, and these sorts of waves that seem to occur with some regularity over time. So that's my kind of congressional races to watch. I'm happy to talk more about some of those races in the Q&A. But if we can advance the slide, I'm gearing up to conclude. So I want to stress a kind of list here of ordinary versus extraordinary. We've got ordinary factors, partisanship that actually shapes our perception of reality as well as our beliefs about what should be done about that reality. The fact that presidents have a lot of influence over their parties, but they're also limited. And that our elections are really decentralized in their rules and in their control. Once again, of course, we've got our extraordinary factors, our pandemic, the depth of our concerns about election integrity, that the election will go off without interference, and legitimacy, that the results will be accepted by everybody. And finally, this sort of looming presidential impeachment in a re-election year has been kind of lost in the excitement of 2020 and all of the challenges that we face, but I think is actually still a political factor that deserves greater scrutiny. So to really wrap up, my final slide here, I just want to emphasize things that are kind of at this intersection of ordinary and extraordinary. So local and national political forces are in tension. This has long been true, but as our election conversations become more nationalized and our system continues to be decentralized, I think that we're starting to see some interesting results of that tension. Partisanship has always been part of American politics, but it's increasingly divided along race or urban, rural, identity, and this kind of sorting is a magnification that's not new in 2020, but is a development nevertheless. And that I think the larger point that I want to make in this talk is that even when we have very disruptive politics, when we have politicians who come in with the promise to change how things work, or we have events that seem like they should rock the foundation, that ordinary political forces are very resistant to those efforts to disrupt. But that's not entirely comforting, and that these ordinary forces can still pose some deep threats to our democracy. With that, I'd love to take some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Azari, very much. Well, we have some questions for you. I'm going to remind everybody who's listening and watching that you can contribute to the Q&A portion of this using your chat. So let's begin with a question from a faculty member. Isn't the Republican Party Trump's party in the sense that the party's base consists of Trump loyalists? So President Trump may be beholden to Republican senators, but those senators have to be careful not to offend the base, and the base takes guidance from Trump.
Yeah, so I think that there's a lot going on here. One question, so I want to start with a question we don't know the answer to, which is how many people have stopped being Republicans over the course of the Trump presidency? And obviously some people will have switched the other way, but there's some evidence that part of the reason that Trump has such really consistently high ratings among Republicans is that people who don't like Trump are increasingly identifying as independents in these surveys. But it's hard to know who and how many. And it's impossible to know whether that will last. Again, I think this is only really true for two sets of issues. And that's, I mean, if we have kind of three buckets of issues, one is policy areas that are salient and where most Republicans prior to Trump kind of had an existing political position and that are in the typical Republican wheelhouse. So that's a lot of economically conservative ideas and a lot of socially conservative ideas around like abortion, gay rights. Then we have a bucket of ideas that have always been sort of a second tier of salience in American politics, really for a lot of people in both parties, and that's immigration and the environment fall into that category. And then there's positions that Trump has sort of at least occasionally taken or flirted with that run counter to the beliefs of the Republican base. And that, again, I think is some of these more kind of big government, economically liberal ideas that sometimes come out of what the president says. And I think that on that middle tier, the immigration and the environment, we've seen a lot of movement in the Republican Party toward Trump's position. Trade is another one that falls in that category. But on this latter category, where Trump might be in a position to temporarily move the Republican Party toward negotiation on a stimulus package, or kind of moving in that direction, that's not inconsistent with the kinds of things he said when he was running for office, but he doesn't have the sway. He doesn't have the sway. So in some ways, I think how we might describe the Republican Party, time will tell, is that it's a Trumpian party, in the sense that some of these attitudes on immigration in particular are probably there to stay. But it's not Trump's party in the sense that I don't think he can really get members of Congress to do things that they don't want to do. And why he's not able to persuade his own kind of supporters in the electorate of something like a stimulus negotiation. The answer to that might have to do with conservative media. I'm not sure, but that's how I see it in terms of the limitations of it being Trump's party. And this is, I should say, this is like a really controversial question among political scientists.
We have more. We may have more controversial questions. So this is a question from a junior here at FNM, and their question is, do you think that President Trump's rhetoric to his base about going out and watching the polls will have an effect on voting? Also, do you think he will receive any punishment for doing this if it does end up having an impact? If not, should Democrats make this a bigger deal? So sort of a three-part question.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, it might. This is another area where I think that a small amount of activity can have a lot of impact. So if there's only a couple polling places where this kind of thing happens, then that has the potential to be really kind of problematic for the voting process. I don't know how successful they'll be. I mean, this um, electioneering rules are kind of in place. You can't even wear your t-shirts to the polls. These vary again locally. Um, in general, I would say organization and follow through aren't always there with particularly something like that that will require a lot of vertical organization. So I don't know. I don't know what we're gonna see. In terms of affecting the voting, I think voter intimidation is real, and I don't want to downplay it. There's also research that suggests that when people feel like their right to vote is being threatened, that actually mobilizes them and makes them more determined. So a lot of this, I mean, unfortunately, I don't have a good answer to what I think will happen. A lot of this is kind of in the details of what goes down in a particular situation, how law enforcement reacts, how poll workers react, how the community reacts, and probably the nature of the community and the types of people voting in it. Um, the third question, or I guess the second and third, should Democrats make a bigger deal of this, and will Trump be punished? I think it's likely that if Biden wins, that there will be a strong move toward some kind of public forgiveness. And I know that's probably not what people who are upset about these things want to hear, and I could be wrong. But that is my sense of their direction, and that there will be some hesitancy to kind of raise the stakes on all issues. Um, in terms of the Democrats making a bigger deal of this, ideally, what I would like to see, I'm just going to say my opinion since you asked it. Ideally, really, what would happen is that everyone would make a bigger deal of this. I think the idea that the integrity of the polls and the right to vote is a partisan issue is one of the most dangerous things about this moment. And it's not that it's totally unusual. The right to vote has always been contested. That contestation has typically occurred within parties rather than being neatly divided between them. But I think that there are probably some real reservations among Democrats in using these things as a campaign issue that makes sense.
Thank you. Are you ready for the next one?
Mhm.
Okay. So these are, looks like a question from a couple students that are writing in together, a student from
Mhm.
class of 2022 and a student from class of 2023.
Mhm.
They ask, what Senate and congressional races do you see changing hands?
Mhm.
What seats could change the control of Congress? And what effect will the results of Senate races have on the effectiveness of the presidency?
Yeah, these are great questions. So here's my Senate prediction, which could be wrong. I see 4 seats. I see the Democrats picking up 4 seats, which means that the balance of Congress will be the same, just with a different party in the majority, balance of Senate. So I think the Democrats are likely to pick up Arizona, Colorado, and Maine seem pretty likely Democratic. And then the only really close race that I feel confident saying the Democrats have a good shot at is Iowa. Joni Ernst and Teresa Greenfield. Um, I just am not sure on the rest of them. We have competitive races in North Carolina. There's it's a crazy 2 races in Georgia. Um, I think those will likely revert to being Republican. So yeah, that's kind of my read of the map, and that very close Senate is really brings up a lot of questions about how the Senate should govern itself and whether there should be a filibuster. And I honestly don't know what the Democrats will do. I think there will be some pressure for filibuster reform, particularly if there are big issues on the table and a kind of large Republican minority blocks it. I'm not sure what the possibilities are for cross partisan policy building, but particularly because as the Republican delegation shrinks, it becomes more conservative typically. So the conservatives are kind of a higher percentage. So like you lose people like Collins and Gardner. which I think is likely, then you lose those possible compromise votes. So that may be a pretty big confrontation, and a pretty big confrontation within the Democratic Party. The House, I think, is not as exciting at this point. My guess is the Democrats will maybe pick up like 10 seats. The thing about the House is, like, once you have the majority, you have the majority. You control the goodies. You control pretty much the agenda and the committees. The Senate is different. The margin matters a lot. And the idea that Democrats will pick up, will come close to a filibuster-proof majority, I have doubts. The 538 forecast has, I think, 80% chance that the Democrats will control anything between 48 and 55 seats. So I would consider 55 sort of a ceiling. But yeah, I mean, there are a lot of close races, so who knows?
We have a question from another student. This is from a junior government major. What are your thoughts on President Trump refusing to leave if the result is not acceptable to him, citing voter fraud?
Mhm.
What happens then?
Yeah, no one really knows. So that's not very comforting. I think in the situations where those sorts of attempts are successful, you need to have the military. And I think that the military has sort of been pretty reluctant to side with Trump on some of these issues. The real, I think, concerns are about the certification of the election results, the certification of the Electoral College, the possibility of an Electoral College tie, in which case the House would vote by delegation, which would favor Republicans, even though it's very unlikely that Trump in that scenario has won the popular vote. And then there are questions about the role of the Supreme Court in certifying the vote count in, maybe in a couple of close states. So those are the scenarios I'm more concerned about than a kind of Trump refuses to leave. This isn't really a solo operation, but rather than in some of these scenarios, that what we would see is something that's maybe procedurally correct according to the rules as they're in place, but reflects a pretty big disparity between the popular vote and the outcome of the election. That, I think, would be pretty destabilizing.
Another question from a student. You mentioned that one of the ordinary political foundations is the influence presidents have, but at the same time it is limited. And I would like to ask why you think voters and the public in general afford so much symbolic power to the president when our legislators play a possibly even more influential role in actual policy change and reform.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really great question. And I spend basically my whole semester when I teach the American presidency on some version of that, question. So there's a couple of different reasons. I think that the media environment really favors a president. You have a kind of single person who can, prior to the internet age, when things were really about TV, can really use television to his advantage. I also think that this goes back deeper into the 20th century and into some solutions that were advanced by progressive presidents from both parties. So like Woodrow Wilson, who was a Democrat, Theodore Roosevelt, who was a Republican, and they saw the way the American system worked is like very localized, decentralized. Members of Congress were very like rooted in their districts, and not a lot of change could happen, right? And so some of these same problems we're talking about with the filibuster is like there's a majority and yet you don't really see policy change. And like there was this idea of like we kind of need a system that's more responsive, and a government that can step in more around the idea of like managing industrial capitalism. So this was a current of thought, as I said, not agreed on by everybody, but was part of the thinking in factions in both parties. And coincidentally, when it turns out when people with presidential ambitions or who are president are doing the thinking and doing the kind of institutional reforms, they're like, who really has the power to represent the whole nation? Oh, it's the president. Funny that. So I think this is kind of a deliberate effort on the part of presidents to cultivate that idea that they're the national spokesperson and they can make politics more responsive, whereas Congress is just a bunch of kind of local people that are not thinking about the whole country, but just about their district, and they don't get anything done. So it's a very, very simplified answer of an excellent, more complicated question.
Thank you. This is from a staff member. Election day results from the media in the past. Election day results from the media in the past relied on exit polling. With much of the votes being cast by mail in this election, how will that affect the results predicted by the networks?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And some of the answer to that question is probably in the statistical projections, right? So you can get a sense of like what how many people in a given area might have been voting by mail. You know the rules in that state about voting by mail. And I think you can sort of get a sense. But I think that, I mean, networks have been a lot more conservative about predictions on the basis of exit polls since 2000. And will probably stick to reporting based on percentage of precincts that are reporting. That will be scrambled because some places have laws against counting the ballots early and others don't. Early ballots that come in. So I think that'll actually be more of our source of confusion, but you're right that the exit polls will be really strange, and hopefully networks won't rely on those to make calls.
This is from a faculty member. What does Joe Biden's nomination say about the weakness or strength of party organizations? This seems like an example of the quote party establishment unquote steering the nomination to its preferred outcome.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. And I have a kind of ongoing debate with another party politics scholar about this, with Seth Maskett of the University of Denver. So sort of takes that view. Like this is an example of the party establishment getting its way. And my argument is, okay, Biden came out, he was the preferred establishment candidate relative to Sanders when it came down to those two. But really, if you looked early on, I think there was a lot of Democratic elite reservations about Biden, about his age, about some of the things that he had maybe done, or some of the accusations that he'd been like a little inappropriate with people. I think also having the sort of baggage of a previous administration is not an obvious advantage all the time. That I think has proven a little different in this context. So Democrats are pretty nostalgic for Obama, but I think if the establishment really had its way, they might have looked to a candidate more like Kamala Harris or Cory Booker. They're a little bit younger. They're more diverse in their backgrounds. I think they're kind of both a little smoother on the stump most of the time. But it's hard to get at exactly that. It's hard to get at exactly the distinction there. I think what my colleague, his case is sort of that a lot of activists had settled on Biden as like their good enough choice, and that's kind of where the establishment was. My sense is that if the establishment really could have controlled this, they would have advanced one of those other two nominees that really didn't take off at all with the public.
This is our last question for you. We're down to our final minute or so. But we want to pack it in because there's so many interesting things to ask you. So last question, should we be worried that the Republican Party didn't formally set a platform, but rather broadly endorsed Trump? Or are platforms an ordinary force that aren't that helpful?
Yeah, so I think that, yeah, I mean, I think that's not great. I don't know that it's the greatest threat to democracy, but I think it's part of a larger set of concerning things around, first of all, that like Trump can't really control everything that goes on in the Republican Party, but there isn't really an organized opposition to him within it. I think is also really telling that the Lincoln Project has essentially, instead of challenging him in the primaries, has just completely exited the party for this election cycle. And I see the platform is kind of a reflection of something like that, right? There's not like a group of Lincoln Project type Republicans or more establishment but very conservative Republicans writing a platform. But the other thing, so it's concerning from like a president party perspective, but it's also concerning in the sense that Trump doesn't actually have a lot of like detailed laid out policy proposals. So they're deferring to something that in some ways doesn't really exist. is kind of, is kind of an outline what the Trump administration presented for their second term plan. I think it's really dangerous to have one party that essentially campaigns on a set of abstract ideas and on grievance, and then one party that is trying to have policy ideas, which may or may not be any good at a given moment. You really need lots of different perspectives on hard policy problems. And to see one party kind of give that up is, I think, really concerning.
Dr. Azari, thank you so much for your presentation and your clarity. And I'm going to remind everybody that there's some details in the chat if anybody wants to continue these discussions further at Weiss and Brooks later today. And we'll see you next week, Wednesday at 1:30. Thank you, Dr. Azari, very much for your presence with us today.
Thank you all.
Thank you.